That's not oil.
All right, let's start off with some sincere boilerplate here. This year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. BCTV, Downtown Brattleboro Alliance, The Hatch, Tim Mayo, Stepansky Family Charitable Trust, Thompson Trust, the Vermont Arts Council, the Vermont Community Foundation, the Vermont Humanities Council, Vermont Public Radio, and the Wyndham Foundation. We would also like to thank our advertisers, and as always, encourage you to support them. The festival is run entirely by volunteers, but has some very real expenses, so we encourage you to make some donations at the donation box sometime this weekend. Time is running short. Or online at our website. Now's the time to turn off the ringer on your phone, but please use it to take pictures and share them online with us and the known universe of social media. Tom Callahan informed me for sure that it was George Plimpton who came up with the line, the smaller the ball, the better the writing. And we're going to put that theory to the test this afternoon. I know we have two of the best in the business here today, James Dodson, Tom Callahan. They've covered a lot of ground, so I'm not going to waste too much time on introductions here. That's what your programs and Google are for. But they also covered a lot of ground in coming here today, and I thank them for that, from Virginia, from North Carolina, by way of Maine. So I discovered that the three of us have a couple of things in common, other than writing about golf. We've all played golf with Arnold Palmer. In my case, it was after a morning interview with him, and I somehow inveigled myself into playing 18 with Arnie and having a couple of beers with him in the clubhouse afterwards. This was not one of the greatest thrills in my golfing life. It was the best, far and away. It was one round, one day, and I can only imagine what it's been like for these two guys who spent years and decades hovering around the king. We've all also met Donald Trump. Jim actually played golf with Eric Trump. It shows some kind of fortitude. I'm not sure I'd be up for it, unless it was part of some clinical study, maybe. More appropriately for the literary festival, he also played with John Updike. But let's start with Tom Callahan, who actually has covered all sports, and a writing life that included stints at Time Magazine, Washington Post, Golf Digest. He's written books on Johnny Unitas, Tiger Woods, including Going into the Bush to Find the Guy who Tiger was named after, and several collections of his columns on many of the sports greats he's met over the years. One may be the best titled sports book in all time, The Bases Were Loaded, and So Was I. If he doesn't mention it in his talk, I'd press him in the Q&A about his fight with Sonny Liston, maybe the kangaroo story. But Golf Digest used to send him off every decade to Palmer's home base in Latrobe, Pennsylvania to write the stories, Arnie turns 60, Arnie turns 70, Arnie turns 80. Unfortunately, there won't be an Arnie turns 90, but those visits, plus a lifetime of talking about Palmer with his playing contemporaries, left Tom with a lot of material to choose from, and he chose wisely in his book, Arnie, The Life of Arnold Palmer. New York Times called it so rich in anecdotes it begs to be savored like a box of chocolates. But an even better blurb came from Tony Kornheiser. Tom Callahan writing about anything is like Julia Child saying, if you don't have any plans, stick around and I'll make you dinner. So first on the menu, Tom Callahan.
They told me to stay here and they're going to take the podium away. I guess I should talk about my relationship with Arnold. The thing about Arnold, I was just one of the millions who he was sweet and kind to. He was a guy who liked people. And I first had him to myself in the early 70s. My first master's was 72. And two guys on Thursday broke 70. The eventual winner, Jack Nicklaus, and Sam Snead, who turned 60 years old a month later. And Palmer shot 70. But later that year, he came to Cincinnati. I was boy columnist at the Inquirer in Cincinnati. And he came to Cincinnati for a charity event. And I asked him, what's the charity getting and what are you getting? Typical of me when I was 22. And he said, his eyebrows shot up, and he said, "You're going to have to ask Mark McCormick," that was his agent, "about the charity." He said, "I'm getting $12,000. Gary Player's getting $8,000. Everybody else is getting $1,000 apiece. Is there anything else you'd like to know?" And that's when we became friends. And I kind of apologized, or stuttered, I guess. And he said, "Don't ever apologize for doing your job." And so that was pretty good advice. And so through the years, I was with him many places. I was sitting just like this, uncomfortably in front of his desk once. And he looked over at me and he said, "Doesn't your ass hurt by now?" And I said, "Yeah, it does a little bit." He said, "Well, let's go play golf." And he and I played at Latrobe out of his bag. I didn't even have golf shoes. You know, we played a bunch of holes, and he told me his stories. And the great thing about him, and Jim knows this better than I do, he trusted you to kind of know what was on the record. He wasn't one of those guys who said, "Don't quote me on this." You know, he told you the story, and he figured you knew what was fair game and what wasn't. And a lot more was fair game than you'd think. I luckily had a bunch of reviews on this book, not for me, but for Arnold. And every one of them seems to mention one little story. So it must be one of the best little stories in the book. In the late 60s, 2 soldiers in Vietnam, they were in Chu Lai. I knew a little bit about Vietnam, and the Chu Lai is a sand country, it's sand dunes. And they would practice their bunker shots in the morning, and then they'd practice their real shots at night. And they sent Arnold a letter and addressed it Arnold Palmer, Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Of course, it got to him. And they wanted advice on how far do you open the sand wedge to, and how far do you hit behind the ball. And Arnold sent him back a note, and they were Chicago guys, and he said, "Well, come see me when you're back in Chicago. Be safe, take care, all that. I'm sending you 2 new sandwiches and a bunch of balls. Don't hit them out of bounds." And so luckily, both guys made it home alive. And one of them went out to the Western Open and waited outside the clubhouse for Palmer. And Palmer came out, and he walked up to him and he said, "I'm one of the guys you sent sandwiches to in Vietnam." And Arnold said, "Are you Jay or Willie?" He remembered their names. Now, I've been around a lot of athletes. I've only been around one that I put ahead of Palmer as an interesting character to write about. Only one. One more compelling figure. But I never knew any athlete that could pass that test, you know, who actually knew people. And the funny thing about him, as Jim will tell you, he wasn't great about names, about our names. At least he wasn't great about my name. Tom's a pretty easy name. But I was always Pro. "Hey, Pro," because he knew me. Hey, Bud, you know. I'd say, "Arnold, it's Tom. I'm Tom," you know. And you know, for some reason he couldn't hold those names in his head. But anytime he ever met anybody, he wanted to know them. He wanted to find out about them. And by the way, he wasn't perfect. And I didn't feel obligated to make him perfect in my book. He was married for 45 years to a woman he adored, but he loved all women, and more than a few loved him back. And I had a great friend named Bob Rosberg, won a PGA, and loved Arnold, and long dead. But he told me once that they used to room together in the Hungry Days on tour, and it was his job, Rosberg's job, to kind of placate the angry husbands who called in at the hotel. And Rosberg said there was one guy I just couldn't solve him. You know, I couldn't calm him down. So finally I signed off by saying, "My bed is the one by the window." You know, he didn't want to get shot in Arnold's place. You know. But the funny thing is, Arnold would talk about that, you know, with me. He kind of trusted me. And he didn't pretend. He never pretended that he was perfect. But I'll tell you what, he was awfully good. And he was a fun guy to write about for me because it gave me a chance to go back and see all the guys that were available to talk. You know, Gary Player and Jack Nicklaus, guys who wanted to talk about him. And almost everybody, even Tiger, You know, Arnold said the best thing about Tiger Woods to me that I ever heard. We were just talking about him, and it was after all the trouble. And Arnold said, I think when Tiger lost his father, he lost himself. He said, my wish for him isn't to come back as a player, but to come back as a man. And you can't say it much quicker than that. But even Tiger, and I'm not Tiger's favorite, believe me, he called, I put a message in without much hope to get him, and he called me because he wanted to talk about Palmer. You know, he was willing to talk about a dinner they had when he was at Stanford and things. You know, I mean, everybody, almost to a man, you know, valued him. He wasn't the best player. There weren't many better players. There were very few better players, but he wasn't one of the best players. He wasn't one of the top 5 guys, I'd say, though he won 60-some PGA Tour events. You know, Mickelson's only won 40-some. But he was the most important player, by far. You know, I mean, he came along, he lifted the country club game, put it on his shoulders, carried it to the people, made it a sport. You know, people who didn't follow golf followed him. Anybody who ever worked at a newspaper like I did in the early days knows, sitting on the desk at night, the calls that would come in on the weekend, what did Palmer do? You know, people didn't really care about the tournament. What did Palmer do? And his timing was so good. He was delivered with the first TV sets. You know, he was just so important, and he never let anybody down. And it mattered to him that people loved golf. You know, it was kind of the key to him in a way. If you loved golf, he liked you. He wanted to know you. And so anyway, that's what pushed me. I went to, I'd heard he had a fall in 2015, and he separated his shoulder. And the truth is that never healed. He said he tripped on a rug because he didn't want everybody to be mad at his dog, Mulligan. He tripped on Mulligan. And it never got better. And that was kind of the start of his demise. But I went just to look at him. I hadn't seen him in a while. I went just to kind of size him up. And I'm in the press room at Bay Hill, where he had his tournament every year in May. And he's having a press conference. He's selling blood pressure pills, you know, with actors and astronauts, and you know. And so he's having this press conference, and he spots me, and into the microphone he says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "What are you talking about? This is a big tournament." And he said, into the microphone, "Don't give me that shit." Like that. And half the people in the room didn't even know what we were talking about. You know? But that's when I said to myself, I'm going to write a book about him. This guy wrote the book about him, you know, the best one, and with him, and he had the hardship of having IMG looking over his shoulder, because Arnold's business people, you know, they were kind of, I'm sure they were kind of the editors of that book.
I'll tell you that story.
Oh, I want to hear it. And Bev Norwood, I might have been there. But so luckily, I didn't have any worries. And Palmer, he went out of his way. He was really failing by last June of 16, when the Open was going on at Oakmont in Pennsylvania, which is down the street, really. It's 40 miles from Latrobe. But he was too fragile to go. And he was a little ashamed at how fragile he looked. But he told his aide, Doc Giffen, he said, "Tell Tom to come." He knew I'd be at the U.S. Open. He said, "Call Tom, tell him to come." And so I was there. I sat Thursday, the first round, and we talked in his office. And it was so much fun, because his memory and his sense of humor was still there. You know, he couldn't hear a thing you said, but he was just so lost. You know, he couldn't get up, he couldn't stand up. But he was so proud of his memory anyway. He was a guy who, you know, someone would ask him, "Do you remember this?" And he'd rattle off everything that happened and said, "That's all I can remember about it." You know, he couldn't remember everything about it, and he was proud of that. But anyway, so that was the last time I talked to him. And he did the thing that the writers all appreciate. When I turned off, I had a little tape recorder, I turned off my tape recorder, and he said, "You got enough? You got enough?" That's the thing. Anybody who ever says that to me, I love them. Ali used to say that. "You got enough?" You know? And he was so good. And then he said, okay, we're done, right? Tell me something. How's Dan? He's talking about Dan Jenkins, who's a writer, who's his age. And Dan's still going, but he's, every time I see Dan, I like mentally say goodbye to him and hope I'm wrong. But he really looks 88. But typical, Arnold. He kind of associated me with Jenkins, and rightly so. Jenkins sent this book to George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bush sent me a note saying that started. Any friend of Dan Jenkins, ... has to be investigated by the Secret Service. And I think Tom made reference to it. Oddly enough, I've had 3 notes from presidents on this book. Again, it's not me, it's Palmer. Palmer knew everybody. Clinton sent me a note. But the note I got from Donald Trump proves he doesn't remember me. Because he was introduced to me at ringside of Tyson, Michael Spinks. It's a long time ago in Atlantic City. And I was with Time Magazine then, and I had written a cover story on Mike Tyson that was on the stands that week. And so Trump, he's talking to me about this story I wrote, and it's fine. And then he says to me, would you have any interest in writing my next book? And I said to him, I wouldn't have any interest in reading your next book. So he looked at me like he heard me, but he didn't understand me. But when I got this sweet note from him, I can't wait to read your book. It looks terrific. Well, I know he won't read. He doesn't read the books. But I said to my wife, this proves he doesn't remember me. Of course. But anyway, I think that's enough. You asked me what you want about Arnold or about anything. I've been a lucky guy. I spent my life like at the finish line for Secretariat's Triple Crown in Belmont. I was at the Russian U.S. hockey game in Lake Placid. I was in Yankee Stadium when Reggie Jackson hit 3 straight home runs off 3 different pitchers, opening pitches. I was in Zaire. Ali, he was the most compelling figure in my time in sports. Ali used to greet me with the same phrase every time. How's Angie? I like her better than you. And he never met her. He never met her. But I was in a room. I was home and I was trying to get off the phone with him years ago. And he was a hard guy to get rid of. And Champ, you got to go. I've got a deadline, Champ. And finally, I handed the phone to my wife, and I went in the next room, and I wrote a column, and it took me an hour and a half. And I came out, and they were still talking. And he never forgot it. He walked into, I was in Zaire, pretty dramatic, 4 o'clock in the morning, 100,000 black faces in the arena, And of course, typically, I picked George Foreman and won. Students of my picks through the years, I had Evel Knievel against the Canyon. So I spent a life making bad picks. But anyway, Ali comes into this hacienda where all the writers were staying. Bud Collins, sweet Bud Collins in Boston, and Dave Anderson, all the great guys. And he looks on the wall, and we had a gambling thing going, and everybody threw in a few Zaires, and of course I had Foreman and won. And he gets to Foreman and won, and he turns around to me and he goes, we went outside, and I'm a little nervous. We go outside into the darkest, blacker than midnight, and we walk down to the Congo River. This is fairly dramatic. It's midnight on the Congo River. It's just me and Ali. And he says, I'm going to tell you something, and I don't want you ever to forget it. Black men scare white men more than black men scare black men. And of course, that's right. I took a look at Foreman and went, oh God, but he wasn't afraid of Foreman. And when the fight came around, and he was a little afraid of him, he was a little afraid of getting hit by him. And now the interminable anthem, Zaire anthem is playing, and Angelo Dundee, Muhammad's puckish little corner man, he's stuck in Foreman's corner because he wants to see the gloves, He wants to do the business that he had to do. And when the anthem started, he just came to attention and stood there. So Ali's alone in his corner, and I'm in I'm at ringside in the corner opposite, and I'm watching him. He looked great. And he raked his hair, he looked fabulous. And he's going to Dundee. Angelo. And Angelo, he isn't about to move now that the anthem's playing. He's standing there. And finally, Allie goes, Angelo, he's big. Look how big he is. Holy shit, look at him. Look how big he is. And that's when I first thought, uh-oh. And now they have the first round. It was believe me, it was a no-hitter. Allie didn't land a punch in the first round. And Foreman, this was the start of the rope-a-dope, I guess, which was a spur-of-the-moment thing for Allie. He didn't plan it, believe me. But all the serious writers who were there, the big shots, who stayed at the hotel in Kinshasa instead of at the lowly writer place. Norman Mailer, George Plimpton, Hunter Thompson, that whole crowd, Bud Schulberg, they're all screaming during the first round, stop the fight, stop the fight, and I'm going, and I turned to Vic Siegel of the New York Daily News, and he looked at me and he said, these guys are idiots, and I said, yeah, Vic, wrong again. I knew I was wrong halfway through the first round. And when Allie came to the corner, he spit out his mouthpiece, and he looked over my head at his manager, Herbert Muhammad. He said, leave him to me. And then it was a matter of time, 8 rounds. By the time Foreman fell, he fell from all the punches. He didn't fall from one punch. He fell from, he was red, black guy with a red face. He had been jabbed so many times in 8 rounds. But anyway, yeah, I feel lucky that I've been to all these things. Granted, there were a lot of dull places in there in between. But, I went to 30-some Wimbledons, and Indy 500s and Kentucky Derbies, and it was a great piece of luck. And I count one of the greatest is knowing Arnold Palmer. And it pleased me that I've heard from friends and farmers, because every word in this book isn't flattering, but there are enough that are. And I've heard from people who loved him and who didn't mind. And the one I was especially glad to hear from was his grandson who plays on tour, Sam Saunders. And he sent me a long email on the book after he read it, which was nice of him. And so the whole experience was great. I don't expect, as I said, I don't expect to sell 6 copies of it. But I think the few people who will look at it, I hope they'll like it. And because they like this guy. He's a guy that you couldn't help but like him. And the only guy who didn't, and Jim would know about this too, because he wrote a wonderful book on Ben Hogan. But Ben Hogan, couldn't, he never mentioned him by his name. Like Palmer said to me, he said he never once said Arnold, he never once said Palmer. He said, it was always, hey, you. He said, it hurt my feelings. He said, I wanted to know him. He was Hogan, I wanted to know him. But Hogan didn't want to be replaced by him. He might not have wanted to be replaced by anybody. And I forgive Hogan somewhat because he had a tough life. His father killed himself in front of him when he was a child. And there are reasons Hogan was the way he was. And I have friends who knew Hogan well and liked him, including Dan Jenkins. He's a Fort Worth guy, and he was a boy newspaper man around Hogan and found many reasons to like him. But it was odd. Hogan's almost the only guy that Palmer couldn't crack. And it bothered him. It bothered him till the day he died. But as I said, when I started wandering from guy to guy, talking to Gary Player, he's an amazing. He's a South African. He's 5'6". And the way he competed with Jack Nicklaus at the top of his game and Arnold Palmer, he was full of himself. He's like me. He's the hero of all his stories. It's always, oh, Jack was hitting that ball so good, hitting it into the clouds. Remind me of the time I beat him 6-5 in the Dunlop. It's always the punchline is always Player. But even talking about Palmer, he would talk about his father, Arnold's father, who Arnold adored. But Player told me, he said, I never knew anybody who wanted his father's approval more than Arnold did, and I don't believe he ever got it. And that might be harsh, because Doc Giffen is a good friend, and other people said, yeah, he did get it. But And I'm sure Arnold, if he was sitting here, he would say he did get it too. I hope he would. But it was interesting that Player, it kind of made him sad that Arnold missed something, you know, because here's a guy he's trying to beat, but he rooted for him. Even Nicholas, you know, they had a very complicated relationship, Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer. They were mutually jealous of each other. One was envied the other's ability, and the other envied the other's lovability. And so they were always very complicated, but by the end, they had melted a lot. And when I went to the memorial service for Arnold, and Jack could barely get through his talk. You know, and Jack's not a sentimental guy. You know, I mean, Jack's a guy, Arnold, everybody on the golf course, who were ever on a golf course with him, a second time, figured he recognized them. You know, and wondered where the hell have they been? You know, I mean, he would lean on his club looking for pretty girls. You know, he's not thinking of golf through the whole round, you know. But Nicholas, he didn't know anybody else was out there on the moor. You know, he had to train himself just out of decency every 40 minutes to wink, this horribly synthetic wink that made your teeth hurt. You know, but he wasn't a bad guy. It's just he wasn't Palmer. You know, this is a very intramural example, but if you're in a press room and some nervous kid would ask Jack Nicklaus an awkward question, Nicklaus would make a little joke at that kid's expense. But then he'd answer, being a good guy. Palmer, meanwhile, the moment the kid started to fall off the ledge, he'd reach out with that big forearm of his, he'd grab him, reword the question, and answer it before anybody in the room knew it happened. And I almost didn't give him credit for it, because it was like a natural grace. I don't even know where he got it. Maybe my friend can tell us. But anyway, that's enough of a preamble for me, and I'll lateral, and then later we can talk if you want to.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Welcoming Jim Dodson of Brattleboro is actually saying welcome back. He spent some of his earlier pre-golf writing life right here before heading north to Maine and eventually back to North Carolina where he lives today.
That works.
So his current book, The Range Bucket List, The Golf Adventure of a Lifetime, it's actually kind of an extraordinary memoir of his writing life. Places it took him, and mainly the people who he befriended along the way. And it reminds us in one of the chapters that it was his father who nudged Dodson in the direction of writing about golf, and then became the poignant subject himself in Final Rounds, 1966 account of the father and son's trip to Scotland shortly before the elder Dodson's death. I don't think it's overstating the case to say that Final Rounds is an enduring modern classic in the golf writing canon. And it's also the book that provoked Winnie Palmer into calling him up and suggesting he might be the right guy to help her husband write his autobiography. So Dodson did the sensible thing when he heard it was Winnie Palmer on the phone. He hung up, thinking somebody was playing a joke on him. Nonetheless, it came to pass. He did indeed help Palmer with his autobiography, A Golfer's Life. So the Range Bucket List is Dodson's 11th, 12th, I kind of lost count. He's probably now won more writing awards than Palmer did major titles, I think. But his American Triumvirate, a threefold biography of Nelson, Snead, and Hogan, earned him his second USGA award for Best Golf Book of the Year, an award named after Herbert Warren Wind, which is saying something. Because if Palmer was a god among golfers, Herbert Warren Wind was a god among golf writers. He was a master at the long form. One said it took him 1,500 words just to clear his throat. So welcome back, another master of the long form, James Dodson.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for coming out. Beautiful day to play golf. So you made the sacrifice. Before I begin, let me say, to share a stage here with Tom Callahan it's like being with Herb Wind. Herb Wind was the dean of American golf writing, and I think the mantle has now passed to Tom Callahan, who I'd actually never met, but I've certainly read everything he's written that I could get my hands on. He's an amazing, he is to sports writing what Arnold was to golf. So it's a great pleasure. Now, the other part of this is a homecoming for me. This is the first time I've seen this town in 30 years. It saved my life, and I'm not exaggerating if you read the range bucket list. When I was 30 years old, I had been the senior writer for the Atlanta Constitution magazine, which is the oldest Sunday magazine in the country, where Margaret Mitchell worked for 8 years, 7.5 years, covering everything, every corrupt politician in Dixie and every flat-headed, bullet-headed redneck sheriff in Alabama and corrupt Klansman in North Georgia. Really a kind of an odyssey of deep South greed, crime, and Gothic stories. And I hit the wall, and I made a decision when the Washington Post was kind enough, the editor of the magazine there, he said, come up and interview, we'd like to hire you. The terrible thing out of his mouth was, we want you to do those same kind of Gothic stories. I covered 3 presidential campaigns too, so I got to know the Bushes, they were delightful. But I couldn't do it anymore, and I bailed out. And the long story short is, my dad, I went to see my dad, I called him from Bush's office, and he changed my life. I'm sitting on the porch in Pinehurst. I hadn't played golf in 7 years at that point. So a transformation occurred. He suggests, why don't you write about something you love? I said, I love golf, but I can't play it anymore. I'm terrible at it. I don't know anybody in that world. He told me these kind of cornball things. I called him Opti the Mystic. And he said, if you put your faith in this larger universe and focus on that you want to write about that stuff, it'll happen. And it did. It happened because I turned down the Post and I just took a flyer and went to work for Yankee Magazine, which is just over the hill in Dublin, New Hampshire. And I became their first Southerner and their first senior writer in that 80-year magazine's history. It was a great change for me. All my friends thought I was committing professional suicide. I moved to Brattleboro, Vermont, out in West Brattleboro. I got myself a fly rod, a dog from the Wyndham Pound, a puppy, golden retriever. Lived in a house I heated by wood, split my own wood. Now, I grew up in western North Carolina, so I was a hiker and a camper and an Eagle Scout, so that was fun for me. I loved these Arctic nights. I dated a woman who had more underarm hair than I did. Everything in this town tasted faintly of shrubbery from the, I loved it. It was a cultural awakening for me, and I fell in love with Brattleboro. Unfortunately, I started dating an intern at Yankee, and we got married a year later and moved to Boston or North Shore. But I loved this town. It was really the town where my pulse slowed. I fell back in love with books. And I brought my old Hogan irons and went out to the 9-hole Brattleboro Country Club, which someone told me, maybe one of you can confirm this, it's where Rudyard Kipling played golf when he lived here. He was finishing
down, not on the course. Yeah.
Okay, well, I wasn't sure. People told me that, and I was like, seriously? You know, I thought that was really cool.
Good little writer.
Good little. He turned out all right. It helped his career too. So this is a place that really did. I'll forever be grateful for this beautiful, beautiful town. My first day with the woman I married was to the restaurant here down in the middle of the town. And it was great. I loved it. In 1996, when Final Rounds came out, I took my dad back to England and Scotland, where he learned to play golf during the Second World War. He was dying of cancer. And it was a trip we'd always meant to make. I'd been at Golf Magazine for 20 years. I had been very, very fortunate. Tom talks about his career, and boy, nobody matches his. I had a very similar but slightly different kind of career, going from famous politicians and corrupt politicians to golf. And I grew up in a town where Arnold Palmer was beloved, Greensboro, North Carolina, and Winston-Salem, where Wake Forest is. In fact, my father's my Aunt Daphne, as we called her, was Arnold's second roommate at Wake's little sister. That's how connected it all is down there. Everybody marries everybody's sister. But I wasn't sure my dad could make it, but we took off on this trip where he had to go to Lytham, and imagining myself an expert on Britain, I managed to book us into the worst hotels with the lumpiest beds and the sorriest food, and we ended up basically it poured rain the whole time all the way to Scotland. We ended up just sitting in taverns talking about these 2 events that happened. One was in his life, this bomber crash that killed all these kids in town, and was right before D-Day. He was supposed to fly a plane into Normandy, and he was one of the first or second on the scene. He got his hands burned, and and I talked about the murder of my college girlfriend, which happened my junior year in college. I'd really never talked about it. So it became kind of a catharsis in the rain and the English pubs, and we ended up in St. Andrews, and we did play a couple rounds. The book came out in November of 1996, and I thought if all my pink-eyed, lint-eared, redneck cousins in about 5 central counties in North Carolina bought a copy, those that could read, and my mother bought the 200 or 300 I knew she'd buy, that it might sell 500 copies, and I don't even think it did that. And then one day I'm sitting in our barn in Maine, because the girl I courted on Main Street here, we got married, moved to Maine, had kids. The phone rang, and this woman says, "Mr. Dodson, you know your book is on the extended bestseller list, and we want to push it towards, with the holidays, we want to push it forward. Will you go on a book tour?" So I said, "Sure, I'll go." I thought she wanted 2 days, she wanted 3 weeks. Long story short, I went all the way around the country. I got home to Maine 2 nights before Christmas Eve, our little bookshop in Brunswick, Maine, if you know what that is. I'd promised our book signer I'd come in and sign books. I knew nobody was going to be there because A, Mainers are the cheapest people on earth. They're never going to buy a new book. Secondly, the first snow, you know this one, the first snowstorm of the season was bearing down, and no one goes out. They're smart. They shelter down. So anyway, I go, and just as I pull up in my old truck, and you know your phone was attached to your vehicle in those days, the phone rings, and it's sleeting, it's starting to sleet, and there's 2 cars there. I should mention that when I was in Charlotte, you know, in that sort of home country, there was a huge line one night, and they were out the door, and I thought, wow, this book must really be very popular. And you know, and I'm talking to a little lady, and there's a couple that looks like the Grant Wood characters behind her, and the lady signs her books and leaves, and they step forward, and as she's waiting, I hear the little gentleman say, "I don't believe that's him." And then the little lady leans this way, and she says, "No, I thought he's older than that." And they step forward, and I say, "Hey, folks, can I sign a book for you?" And I thought, boy, it's interesting. They like golf. And she said, "You ain't James Dobson, is you?" And I said, "No, ma'am, but I could sign his books if you'd like. That's only a D&B difference. I'm an Episcopalian from the liberal end of the wing, and he's a little conservative." And she didn't think that was funny. And so she took that little man by the ear and walked him out, and they took every 3rd person in that line with them. So that brings your ego back. So anyway, I get home to Maine, and there's 2 cars, and I thought, well, of course they'll think I'm James Dobson, even in my town in Maine. So, but just as I started to get out of the car, and I was going to blow it off, the phone rang, and I answered, and I hear this nice lady say, "Mr. Dodson, this is Winnie Palmer. I wanted to just let you know, Arnold and I have just finished reading Final Rounds, and we wanted to tell you, we think this is her words, a most beautiful book we've ever read, and Arnold would like to ask you if you'd like to write his autobiography with him." That's exactly what she said. Well, that's a thunderbolt for a writer, any writer, and certainly one that grew up that idolized Arnold Palmer. Well, I wasn't. The truth is, I was pretty sure it was my buddies back in Greensboro, North Carolina, at the pub, and they'd had a few pictures, and they'd gotten a waitress to put the phone to her ear and pretend to be Winnie Palmer. So I was very clever. I said this thing. Here's what I said: "Mrs. Palmer, that's really great. The truth is, the Nicholases are coming to Maine this year for Christmas. In fact, I'm on the way to Portland Jetport to pick them up, and I'm going to take them to a place on Small Point where I took them a few years ago. And I got to tell you, if things go like it did that night, we're going to get entirely shit-faced and make out like bandits, Barbara and me. I'll have to call you back." And I hung up. I was really proud of myself. I went in, I signed my 1 book, and there was indeed a woman there that thought hoped I was James Dobson, the Christian broadcaster, but she did manage to buy a book. So I drove home. It's now pouring snow. I shoveled my way to the door. My wife and the kids had gone up to Grandma's house in Skowhegan, and I let myself in. I turned up the heat, and I go in the kitchen. You know, your answering machine was on the wall. I push the button. I hear the same lady laugh. She says, "Mr. Dodson, this really is Winnie Palmer." Arnold thought that was the funniest thing he's ever heard. And he said to tell you, now he wants you to do the book more than ever. But he's gone to bed. You call us in the morning. And I did. And days later, I went to see him in Boston at the Wilmette dinner, and we hit it off. I mean, we knew a lot of the same people, and I was very gratified. And here's the point Tom raised about IMG. I said, and this is in the book. By the way, the Range Bucket List is, if Tom had the most incredible career, I had maybe the most incredible, personal, not so famous career. I mean, I knew a lot of famous people and stuff, but this is a game, it was a sanctuary for me. I went there because I loved it. and it did change my life. And so mine are very ordinary people in here, but some of them are really funny. And some of them are really well known, like Updike and others. But some of them are just very, very wonderful people that celebrate the game and can feel the tissue of this game the way Tom does, and others here. My friend Tom Herrick, I guess he left. No, there he is right there. I would recognize him without hair. I haven't seen him in so long. This book, so Final Rounds was a book that Arnold connected with because of his father. And when he asked me, and there's a chapter in this book about this, I said to him, I thought I was talking myself out of a job. I said, I want to write a book that feels like you're sitting with your fans having a Kettle One, and you're telling them it's not an autobiography, it's the 10 or 15 or 20 things in your life that shaped your life. Good, bad, I want to know the terrible things. I can write this from cooking. Come on in. I said, I want to tell the things that shaped your life, and I want to hear the hard things. Now, here's why you should love Arnold Palmer. He looked at Wendy, he said, what do you think, babe? And she said, I think that's great. And I said, I don't want IMG, anybody else looking at this, just you, Doc, Wendy, and me. And he said, okay. And in 2 years, I traveled with him extensively all over the place, stayed at their house. We became very close friends. He never once said to me, you can't use this, and he told me amazing things, a lot about those women Tom's talking about. And here's a story that, well, I didn't put it in the book, and I've only told it a few places, but one day in 1980, we're driving over to the Golf Channel, which he owned, and we're driving along, and we've been talking about women and stuff, and he suddenly pulls off into a little strip shopping center, and he says, he thought it was funny to call me Shakespeare. He says, so Shakespeare, remember we're talking about this women? And I said, yeah, and he said, well, let me tell you a story. And air conditioning's running, it's 101 in Orlando. He says, well, I don't know if this was 86 or 87, somewhere in there. I used to have a lot of fun on the tour. So did Jack, by the way. So did a lot of guys. The values it was a different world then. But you remember Cosby had one of those deals where the woman had a paternity suit? And I said, yeah. And he said, and I don't know what year that was. That was probably about 84, 85. He said, I had one too. And I came home, and Wendy was sitting in the living room, and she said, okay, here's the deal. You've had your fun, and if you can look and you can squeeze, but if I ever find you crossing the pain again, I'll be gone. You'll come home. And he started crying. And he said, so I look, I squeeze, but I've never, he said, I can't lose Winnie. She's the rudder on my ship. And he was just crying his eyes out. We had a great, I could give you a lot of stories. But I want to just mention a couple quick things, tales that tell a lot about Arnold. One morning we're working in the shop. We're both super early risers from my old reporter days, when you had to catch the politician when he was coming in from his assignations. I'm always up at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and Arnold, we would meet. I stayed at their house, and we would walk across up the street to his shop, and he would wind clubs and put grips on. And ask him one morning, we're talking about his early career, and I said, let me ask you something. What do you really think of Jack Nicklaus? Tom alluded to this. He laughed. He said, well, I'll tell you what, Shakespeare. Hand me the new morning paper, dear. I hand him the Pittsburgh paper. He rolls it up, and he says, don't move. Let me go take my morning Nicklaus, and I'll come back and tell you. And then he winked. And then he came back, and he talked about what you heard Tom say, that they needed each other. And Jack came along and really challenged Arnold for leadership. But I think Tom might be the author of one of the best things I've ever heard about Tom and about Jack and Arnie, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't Plimpton, but I believe it was you who said, God said you'll be the greatest to Nicklaus, and he whispered to Palmer, but they'll love you more, right? Am I right?
I've been rewriting that line for 4
Good.
years.
You should it should be on a coffee cup, at least. It's a great line, and it perfectly summarizes the popularity of those two. Jack really is the greatest player. Couple quick things. This book ends with me going to see Arnie 3 weeks before he died. And if you can read that last chapter without crying your eyes out, because I sure as hell cried all the way home, 7 hours from Latrobe. I was with him 2 days. He was on a walker. And I'll give you some of why this is so poignant for anybody who loves this game. And he really was the greatest. The game grew 12-fold by my count from 1960 to 1986, kind of his great career. His career was only about 7 or 8 years, his major career. But I mean, his impact was seismic across the world. I drove up to see him. Doc Giffens called me and said, you need to come up here. He wants to see you. And I'd see him. My wife and I would travel with him every other year, go see them in Palm Beach or Palm Springs and down at, and certainly Latrobe. I'd go see him every other winter, and we'd sit and talk. And, it was great fun. He was very connected to our kids. It was just wonderful, and us, his grandchildren. And he was on a walker. I walk in to his house, and there's a big house he built for Kit, his second wife, and he waves me over, and he's sitting there with his walker. Guess what he's watching? Big screen TV. He's watching Gunsmoke, which was the #1 TV show the year Arnold Palmer ruled the world. And he talks to me, and I just literally thought we were going to have dinner, or actually I was going to spend the night and see him the next morning. The Master's Journal asked me to write an essay. So I said, he said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to go to the club and have dinner. I'm going to go along, he says. And the kid says, no, he could really barely move. He did. He ate ice cream. The next morning, I go into his office, and he's sitting there, and he told me over dinner privately, leaned over and said, you know, I can't hit a golf ball anymore. Tom mentioned his shoulder problem. He said, I can't get the club back. But I've got these girls coming in tomorrow that are going to exercise me, and it'll be fun to see if and I said, Arnold, trust me, they're going to exercise you. You're going to be able to hit a golf ball. When he told me one night at the dinner table with Arnold snoozing from 3 kettle ones off to starboard, as we sat at the dinner table, she said, the minute Arnold Palmer can't hit a golf ball or flies in an airplane, he will not be with us anymore. Well, he gave up flying, 5 years before that, and that was very hard. And so the next morning, I'm sitting there, and he comes in, and we talk, and he's signing things. He's just sign. He signs everything. This is another jump back to a memory, but one morning, one afternoon after golf at Bay Hill, I'm sitting there. His secretary had sent down a stack of yellow flags, and Arnold's signing them, and Tiger Woods walks through, and this tells you something about Tiger Woods, I think. Tiger, and this is Arnold's crew from the day's golf, and we're just a bunch of guys sitting around having a beer. Tiger walks over and he says, hey, Arnie, and he says, let me ask you, Arnold, do you sign everything anybody puts in front of you? And he said, I sure do. And he said, well, my gosh, I mean, if some guy like put his boxer shorts there, I bet you'd put your autograph on it if he asked you. And Arnold laughed, and he said, you know what, Tiger, I probably would. And the truth is, he said, the minute you decide you don't want to give a fan your autograph, is the minute that fan begins to forget you. And that's pretty profound. Anyway, the girls come in. I don't know, talk for about an hour. He's signing stuff. The girls come in, and he tells them, he says, you all have never even seen my golf swing. And then Doc Giffen says, well, here's this, look, Arnie, as a matter of fact, we have a colorized version of the 1960 Masters, the highlights. And he reels it in, and the camera, the screen's here. Arnie's where Tom is. The two 19-year-old girls are behind him. Doc Giffen stand here. He puts it on. There's Arnold on the 17th tee. He's just one stroke back. He birdies the hole in this cross-country putt he makes. You were probably there. And then he's on 18. He pegs up the ball, makes that famous corkscrew swing. It's Jim McKay is just going crazy. The fans are going crazy. You see him make the putt. He throws his hat in the air, and he wins his second Masters. This is off and running, the greatest year anybody's had in golf. He also wins the US Open that summer. As Arnold's swinging on the tee, I'm looking at Arnold. I know what the screen, I've seen this a million times. He's looking at the screen, they're looking at the screen. And the two girls are like they're just in gaga land. He's crying. The tears are coming. He goes, there it is, girls, there's my swing. And the tears are just coming down his face. Well, of course, the waterworks hit me. Now I'm crying. And so he says, girls, y'all go ahead over. I'll be over in the gym in a minute. And I sit down with, he waves me over the desk. He starts signing again. And I said, well, I got to get going. And he goes, where are you going? And I said, well, Wendy, my wife, who Arnold loved, and I'm going to maybe look at a house. He begged me forever about going home again. He said, you have to get back to Greensboro the way I never left Latrobe. You've got to have a place that your soul and heart is in. And I told him, well, New England owns a huge part of my soul, but Greensboro was the place I love most. He said, well, you need to get back there. So I said, guess what? Wendy and I are going to look at a house. I said, if I get home by 7 o'clock tonight, it's a 7-hour drive, so I probably ought to go. And he said, looks at me and he says, and this is another thing he used to say to all of his friends, what can I do for you? Well, I get emotional and I say, you did everything. You changed my life. You know, I mean, Ben Hogan came my way and the lovely books I've been able to write since. You can't do anything for me. And then I said, then I remembered, actually there is one thing. I took out of my briefcase the first copy that came when I got A Golfer's Life. Then you open the box that the publisher sends you. It's the first edition, the very first one I took out. I said, I've never asked you for an autograph. And he looked at me and he said, give me the book. And he took it like that. And I'm not going to tell you what he autographed in it. It's in the book. But he shut it and he said, I just have two, in that massive hand, he took my hand, he wouldn't let go, and he said, I have just two things to tell you. I said, what's that? He said, don't look at that until you're safely home, and don't ever show up here again without Wendy. Because he liked her a hell of a lot more than he liked me. So, you know, that's Arnold. Last little Arnold story. One night, Winnie, Arnold and I are at the tap room at Pebble Beach. It's dark, it's Friday night, it's the kind of the bar of the golf world. Everybody's in, there's a million people in there. Arnold orders the drinks and says he's got to go to the gents. He disappears, he comes back, his whole shirt is soaking wet. Winnie goes, Arnie, what the hell happened to you? What the heck happened to you? He goes, well, that's funny, he's still laughing. He says, well, here's the deal. I went into the bathroom and he said, I stepped up to the porcelain and unzipped and I'm just doing my business, minding my own affairs, and the door opens behind me and this little fella comes shuffling in and he pulls up to the porcelain and he unzips and he looks over the divider once and looks over the divider a second time, looks over the divider a third time, and he said his jaw drops, and he said, next thing I know, he's pulling out his cell phone out of his coat, dialing with his flip phone with his one hand. He says, honey, you're not going to believe who I'm standing next to taking a leak at Pebble Beach. Come on, guess. Very famous. No, more famous than that. No. No, okay, I'll tell you. Jack Nicklaus. Next thing, Mr. Nicklaus, my wife Helen doesn't believe this is really you. Would you mind telling her it's really you? When he said, you didn't. He said, of course I did. He said, I'd be delighted. Takes the phone over the divider. Hello, Helen. This really is Jack Nicklaus, Helen. It's great to see you. What's your husband's name? Tom. Well, you know, Tom has had a great time here at Pebble Beach. He did miss you. He's sorry you didn't get to come along. And you know, the good news is he won all the money in the company outing today, and he said to tell you, you're going to have a hell of a guilt gift when he gets home. It's great to talk with you. Hands the phone back. Arnold said he went to the sink. He was laughing, so he turned on both spigots, and the water just rushed right for sure. That is Arnold. Can you imagine any other celebrity doing anything like that? No, that's Arnold. When he said to me, he's an extraordinary man to whom something extraordinary happened, and that's why he always went home. And that's why he said, Shakespeare, you got to go home. And I did. So we bought the house the next day. I could go on and on. This book is my love poem to golf. I had my own little odyssey through amazing experiences that I never expected to happen through this game. I made my best friends, met my second wife, who's wonderful. And I'm very grateful to this golf world and to Brattleboro, Vermont for launching me into that direction, and Yankee Magazine. So thank you very much.
Time for a few questions. Something, anybody?
Put that up and then I'll hand it to you. After I hand it to you, then I'll wait.
I'll get one for you, Tom. Speaking of Palmer watching Gunsmoke, you had a good line from Dow Finsterwald.
Well, you've got a great memory. Dow Finsterwald was his oldest golfing friend. They had been,
Microphone.
sorry, they were in college around the same time. Dow was at Ohio University in Athens, and Arnold was at Wake Forest. But Dow told me, he said, talking about cowboy movies and cowboys, he said, Arnold will watch anything with manure in it. And it's true. I talked to James Garner in the grill room at Bel Air, and we got to talk about Palmer for some reason. And he said, you know, Palmer likes me. This was some years ago. He says, Palmer likes me. He says, my brother's a club pro out here. He said, at the Oakmont in California, in LA, not the famous Oakmont. And he said, but the reason that Palmer likes me is I did Maverick on TV. And he said, you know, the funny thing is Palmer was kind of like a television cowboy. You know, that's the way I think of Palmer. He says, and I said to Clint Eastwood once, you know, who would you rather be, Clint Eastwood or Arnold Palmer? He said, are you kidding? Arnold Palmer, you know? But yeah, you've got a great memory, T.
speak at once.
Are you going to write a memoir with all these anecdotes that you've been telling us?
No, I don't know. I'm 71 years old, and I've discovered the grandfather business, you know, and it's taken me by surprise. My poor wife, she did all the heavy lifting the first time around. You know, I was at the World Series, you know, and they all forgave me. I was like another kid in the house. You know, I'm ashamed of it now. But now I get a call, like from my youngest grandson. He's figured out how to call me. You know, I was living in St. Augustine. I moved. Now I live 2 miles away from the grandkids. And this is the reason I moved. Ethan, he calls me up. He doesn't say hello. He says, knock, knock. I go, who's there? Owl. Owl who? I'll see you later. And then he hangs up. And he doesn't even talk to me. And I called my son back and I said, I've got to move. I've got to be next door to these kids now. So that's the way I might rationalize getting out of doing another book project. You know, I kind of do what I feel. I'm at the stage of life where I only do what I feel like anyway. You know, and I still keep my hand in at Golf Digest just because I like those people and, you know, I like doing it. And but not too often. If it became work, I'd stop.
So how did you come up with bases are loaded and so was I?
I stole that line, and I gave him credit in the front of it. That was a line from a guy named Ray Fitzgerald, who was a sports columnist at the Boston Globe for many years, good guy. He could write stories that you don't even know why he wrote them or why anybody read them, but you couldn't help but read them. He once interviewed the Wall at Fenway. And it was a Q&A. It was a Q&A with the Wall. It was during the '75 World Series. It was going into the second game, and back and forth, and he's keeping me reading this thing that I don't know, or I don't even know why I'm reading it. And now he gets to the end, and the Wall says to him, "Can I ask you one?" He said, "Sure." He said, "Who do we get today?" And he says, "Bill Lee and Jack Billingham." And the last word of the column was, "Yummy." But Ray Fitzgerald always threatened to write his memoirs and call it The Bases Were Loaded and So Was I. And he died young, and so I took his book and took his title and gave him credit for it.
I wanted to ask James, where in West Brattleboro did you live?
First, the dirt road that meandered along the dirt road that meandered along the river, Brookhaven River. I understand my landlord recently died. I think his name was Richard, all right? And what I remember is the guy that lived at the end of the road that had all the cars in it that would run for governor on the Union Party.
Diamondstone.
Yeah.
Diamondstone.
Yeah, Peter Diamondstone. Yeah, so it's fun. And I make that with, I loved it when I heard that this was a kind of the counterculture center of America. It was so great. I loved living here because I just covered 3 presidential campaigns, and it was fun. And I loved going to the Common Ground, and you know, it was really kind of the awakening of what I think is the Whole Foods movement today. And I felt like I was on the ground floor, even if I did miss collard greens with bacon fat and stuff, all the other stuff. It was an interesting Thanksgiving. I just wrote about it. I added 4 big arts and culture magazines in North Carolina now, which is great, and that I learned from Yankee how to do magazines. And so I just wrote my column about Brattleboro. If you go on O.Henry magazine this month, we have a website, and it's named for the writer O.Henry. I won the O.Henry Award. I grew up in the town where he was from. So, but Brattleboro is very near to my heart. It was a beautiful place to live, and a place that slowed my pulse down and set me on the path to these books.
And I just want to ask also both of you, who do you read today when it comes to sports writers? Is there a particular author that you're, or authors?
Well, I'll let the dean go after me. He'll have the final word. I don't read. I've gotten very disillusioned about sports. It's just too much money. There's a chapter in there where I played indeed with Donald Trump, and I actually made a brief bit of national news by when Eric told me that they'd gotten their funding. I asked him an innocent question: where do you get all the money to buy your golf courses? He said, well, we have lots of money from Russians. And for about a week and a half, I was in a bunker, because every news agency in the world was calling me. I read, I've always read classics. I was a classics major. I flee to that, you know, from Marcus Aurelius to Joseph Campbell. I mean, I read, and I'm working on the book that I've wanted to do, just started on it. It's called about the Great Wagon Road that brought all the Irish, Scots, Germans, Lutherans from Philadelphia out to the Valley of Virginia, and basically the road that created the South. So I've been driving it, writing a history about this great road, and I'm a historian, and I love that. I'm most comfortable with that, although and this is a real labor of love, so I read history. This man probably can tell you who the great current sports writers are.
You know, the industry has changed so much. You know, newspapers of my memory don't exist anymore, and sports columnists don't exist anymore. When I started writing a sports column quite young in Cincinnati, I wrote 5 days a week. I wrote 7 days a week during October, you know, when baseball's going high. But in those days, when I first showed up, the sports writers traveled in entries like racehorses, 101A, you know, and I was Red Smith's last best friend. That's my greatest accomplishment as a writer. I was Red's last best friend, because Red he'd been 101A with Grantland Rice, and then he was with Frank Graham, then he was with Jack Murphy, and I was the pro basketball writer for Jack Murphy in San Diego. And when I got to write a column, I got to know Jack much better. I was on the trail, and so we would pal around together. And any New York event, I'd stay in New Canaan, you know, with Red in his house, and I'd go get quotes, you know, for him. I was like his legs when he was, you know, getting up there, and he was pretty tired. But I know when I get back to the press box with some quotes, like at a baseball game or something, I could tell by looking at him he was okay, you know, don't bother. And sometimes he'd even say, I'm rich, I'm rich. But one time, when Reggie hit the 3 home runs, I had a word with Steve Garvey of the Dodgers after the game, and now I'm running upstairs because I've got a punchline. And Red says to me, I'm rich, I'm rich, I'm rich. And I said, gotta stop you, Red. Garvey told me, he said, the 3rd time that Jackson rounded first base, when I was sure no one was looking, I applauded into my glove. And that was Red's punchline and mine, you know, that day. But yeah, all those old gentlemen sports writers in fedoras and who never failed to introduce the youngest guy to the manager at spring training, they're gone. Now you go into a press box, and the sports writers, they look like a bunch of sharecroppers. You know, they're the worst dressed people in society. You know? It's incredible. You know, where'd all these hitchhikers get into the press box? But the old days, and I'm not saying those guys were all great writers either, but they were more fun at dinner. And you know, so I went to the dinner with the old guys, and you know something, we saw a lot of dramatic sports events, and they were never mentioned at the table. These guys never talked sports at night. They cared only about one thing. Newspapers. That's all they talked about.
You know, I can make a parallel to that, and I'm the same way. When I got sick of covering the tour, because it was when you had to go through the 3rd PR person. When I started covering the tour very early, young, at 30, you could call them up and go hang out with them a little bit, you know, and that was 1983, 84, 85. But my parallel to that is the political hacks, the wonderful old boys on the bus, the Jack Germans. I was the youngest on the tour of the presidential. In 19, really? Yeah, you were colleagues with everybody.
I know, Jack German, we were colleagues.
He was great. He looked at me one time, I on the 2nd presidential campaign, and then the 3rd one was through Yankee, when they all tracked through, like Gary Hart, remember him? When the monkey business hit, he was giving an interview to 4 of us at Yankee sitting around the table when he took a phone call that his campaign was sinking fast. But those guys were the same thing. I loved hanging out with those guys because they just had a million stories, and they would drink their weight in bourbon, and you know, it was really fun for a 20-something kid. And I remember German looked at me at one point. You all remember Jack German, big, chubby guy, brilliant, worked for the Baltimore Sun, I think.
He used to refer to himself as a fat man in the middle seat.
He looked at me. We've been talking for, you know, 3 weeks on this tour, and he looks at me and he says, "Kid, you know, you got talent, but I tell you one thing. This business will eat you alive. You need to get out soon or else you'll turn into me. And he went with these brown teeth. I was like, oh my God, he's right, I'm getting out of this business. But they were fun. Oh my God, they told stories, they loved life. They could nail a politician, what they were really up to. I was in the Mr. Green, this is my microphone. That was in the middle of that with Reagan and Bush, and it was fun. And that was the fun part of what I did. And those days are gone. Now they all have 10 flags, and you have to submit your questions, and they all argue on TV as a result, endlessly, whatever your persuasion is. One last little funny thing. I got a call about that time from the news organization across the street, Ted Turner, this is in Atlanta, and they said, we think you're a terrific writer and you're reasonably good looking and you can talk, so you'd be a good correspondent for the new thing we called it, we Superior Print people, called it the Chicken Noodle Network. And so every time I see one of those talking heads that's graying, I think, good God, that could have been me, so thank God I'm here. Thank you.
Checking out, I think we got a couple more here.
Oh, I don't know, I'm waiting for the next shift.
All right, well,
We got about 5 minutes.
for those of us who play the frustrating game of golf, every once in a while, much rarer than we like to think, sometimes we'll hit it like a pro, out of the sand or go into the cup or whatever. So I'm just wondering, when you played with some of these pros, what was your most embarrassing moment? Like shanking the ball on the tee?
Oh, I know mine. Imagine playing with your childhood hero, Arnold Palmer. This was in the shootout at Bay Hill when I first came down to interview him at Bay Hill, right? So I'm kind of nervous and teased. And I was a 3 or 4 handicap in those days. I was okay, good player. And he walks up to me and he says, don't feel nervous, but we got about $150 riding on this match here. And he says, and for God's sake, don't hook it. First tee, of course, I duck hook it almost into the Bay Hill Lodge. And then the second hole, I did the same thing, and he turns to me, he winks, and he says, don't worry, Shakespeare, I got you covered. And but I mean, it was tough. But then, he was so much fun. I probably stayed with them 15 or 20 times just at their house, just the 3 of us, Winnie and Arnold. And every day we would talk till 10 o'clock, and then he wanted to go have lunch. And then we'd go play golf, and usually with somebody like this dentist that down the street named Jimmy he loved, and somebody famous would come in, and he said one day Rocco Mediate and Rick Smith showed up. Rick Smith's a teacher, and Rocco Mediate, you know who that is. He knew Rocco's dad. He's from nearby Greenburgh. We get into this match, and it's not much. It's like $10 a hole or something, but we're going through the 6th hole, and Rocco's out in the middle of the fairway, and Rick Smith is talking to him earnestly, and Arnold and I are up behind the green, and he looks at me and says, Shakespeare, what the hell is he doing out there? What are they doing? And I said, well, Arnold, Rocco, has back trouble, and he's trying to get his game to the next level, and Rick Smith, as you know, I think you know, is a very famous teacher, and he's trying to coach him into becoming the next Arnold Palmer. Arnold goes, oh, right. And then he goes, what a bunch of horseshit. Anyway, we get around to all these were carryovers to the 16th, I think it's the 16th of par 5. Arnold and I have the honors. We get up on the tee. He says to me, okay, Shakespeare, watch this, the big mammo. That's what he called his giant drives. And he hits this massive drive. It's really fantastic, the corkscrew swing. I get up and outdrive him by about 45 yards. He turns to me and gives me this dark look. I called it the look, kind of a combination of a constipated eagle and a very unhappy schoolmaster. And then they hit, and I then hit a 5-wood onto the green and make the eagle putt. So we win 15 or 16 carryovers. That night he comes over at dinner and he hands me $300 at dinner, and he says, okay, I just have one thing to say to you. He says, don't ever outdrive me again. He says, unless we're playing those chumps.
All right, I'm going to ask the last question. Then Jim and Tom signed some books over here if you're so interested, but Tom, you got to tell us the Sonny Liston story.
Yeah, that's 1,000 years ago. I was, one of my beats at the Baltimore Evening Sun when I was the high school writer, really, was boxing, because they used to have club fights at Dundalk in Maryland, and nobody wanted to go to Dundalk at night, in Baltimore. And so I was the boxing guy, and Sonny Liston was coming into Baltimore to fight his chauffeur, a guy named Amos Big Train Lincoln, in the Baltimore Civic Center. And it was a scoop for me. They felt so sorry for me. boxing promoters. They said, "You're getting killed by the Morning Sun guy. You know, come on, we'll get you together with Sonny." So we went out to Dulles Airport to pick up Liston. He flew into the wrong airport. Now he's mad. He's in the back seat with Geraldine, his beautiful wife, and I'm in the front seat, and I'm trying to ask him questions. I ask a question, he doesn't answer. I ask another question, he doesn't answer. So after a few of those, I stop, and we silently make our way to the Belvedere Hotel in Baltimore, and he had a suite there. And as I'm a little uncomfortable. I'm going into this suite. I was 21, and somebody handed me a bio of Sonny on the way in. He really only lost 2 fights his whole life, to Ali and to Trevor Berbick. No, I can't remember who he lost. Leotis Martin, but they're probably both fixed. But he was he straddled a desk, and I sat on the bed. And I'm going through this list. I'm asking him questions now, and he's still not answering. And so I'm looking at the door. And finally I got to his age, and I said, "Is this right? Is this possible? Are you only 36 years old?" And he vaulted off the desk, and he grabbed me. And now we're face to face, our nose flattened against each other's noses. And he said, "Anyone who says I'm not 36 years old is calling my mother a liar." Well, I didn't want to call his mother a liar, you know. So we went dancing around the room, and no punches were landed, but we went. There were 2 beds in the room. We went down in the crease, up again. He was providing all the power. We put our elbows through the wall 2 or 3 times. We knocked over a couple of lamps. Meanwhile, these fight guys who are in the next part of the suite, they're panicked. They don't know what's happening, but they know it's not good. And a little boxing corner man named Dick Sadler stuck his head in the door and said, "What are you guys doing, dancing?" And Sonny went, yeah, dancing." They put me down. And years later, long after Sonny was dead, I'm in the Memling Hotel in Kinshasa. And here comes Dick Sadler and he ran across the lobby and grabbed me and said, "Dancing with Sonny Liston," you know? But I wrote all that the next day. They begged me not to, but I wrote it, you know, sorry, you know, I couldn't pass that up.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.